You have to develop an edge to be great at something. I had that. And then, boom, there's something clearly wrong.
You doing your job, umpire?
You're pathetic! How much bigger a point can you screw it up with? Couldn't you see anything?
From New York, John McEnroe.
You either loved him or hated him. But you couldn't not be aware of John McEnroe.
I didn't want to be booed. I wanted everyone to clap for me. But if I wanted to be like my idols,
over the line!
I did learn you gotta be a bit of a lunatic out there.
You cannot be serious!
Who doesn't mind yelling at an umpire, man?
Go around the world, meet girls, then party. I was in such an unbelievable high. #1 in the world. I'm the greatest player that's ever played. Why does it not feel that amazing? You always worry you're too much like your dad. He was a perfectionist. That's my biggest flaw. I was melting down. 37 psychologists and psychiatrists didn't help. It felt like there was no way that it could get worse, but it proved to be incorrect.
John's a perfectionist. In his head, it's never good enough.
I would dwell on tennis matches when I could have been a better dad. That's the worst feeling. You always hear, do whatever it takes to win, at any cost.
Championship to McEnroe!
Is it all worth it?
That was the trailer for the feature documentary McEnroe, and this is Factual America. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. McEnroe is an intimate portrait of one of the most explosive and compelling sporting icons of all time. Set over one New York night, the film takes us on a journey into John's memory to explore why a need for connection drove his tennis career while nearly breaking him in the process. Director Barney Douglas joins us to talk about what it is like trying to get inside the head of this tennis icon. Stay tuned. Barney, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
All good, thank you very much. Good to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. As our listeners and viewers hopefully know, we're listening to the intro. We're talking about McEnroe. Premiered in 2022, although I guess it dropped on Sky earlier this month. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I think. So good to get it into British audiences who missed it in the cinema, which is cool.
It's interesting because you look up the any reviews or anything, they're all like from several months ago. But yeah, no, it's great. It's you had the theatrical release as you mentioned, and if I'm not incorrect, you 3 sports Emmys, I think, and nominated 4, and you won 1 for editing. So congratulations on that.
Yeah, no, that was great. A surprise, but really, really lovely. I guess you never expect to. You don't go into a film looking to sort of win awards or anything, so it's always nice to get a bit of recognition. Really good night at the Emmys in New York, and it's interesting. I shouldn't disrespect the trophy, but it does fit a pint of Guinness perfectly in the top. So
does it?
Good celebration afterwards.
So for all our aspiring Emmy winners out there, just keep that in mind.
It has dual purpose. Yeah,
it's kind of like the Stanley Cup in hockey? They do that. They fill it with champagne and people.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, there
traditional
you go.
winners.
To keep the sports analogies going. So no, I can very well understand. Now having seen the film, I can very well understand why it got nominated and won some awards at the Emmys, because it's not your typical. I would say not your typical sports doc. So maybe for those who haven't had a chance to see it, I think we know what it's about, but tell us what McEnroe is all about, this film at least, and maybe a synopsis.
Yeah. Well, I tried, I guess, to do a portrait of getting inside a bit more of his psyche than we'd be used to seeing. And obviously it was a kind of document of his life as well, and his sporting career. But for me, it's always about the human story. I always felt like, what didn't we know about John? Plenty of people are aware that he's an angry tennis player, and that was and aware of the surname, and that was, I guess, the extent for some people. So it was about getting under the skin of him a bit more and just showing him from different perspectives and trying to understand where his behavior came from, how good a player he was, which I think was often forgotten in latter years. And then trying to kind of wrap that into a kind of feature film of 90 minutes that felt cinematically like you had a natural endpoint as well. So the very short basic premise is John sort of a night in New York with John McEnroe, really, sort of from dusk till dawn, him kind of drifting back into memory and trying to explore, I guess, the way he is, why he is. He's kind of an interrogation of himself, really. And yeah, shot in a way that, as you say, is not your traditional sports doc, trying to make it much more of a kind of cinematic experience and a film experience rather than just go, oh, here's a sports dog and let's reel out some talking heads type thing.
Yeah, and some archive and let it run with that.
Yeah.
But I imagine a true night out with McEnroe, John McEnroe, would be quite incredible.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it was made during the pandemic, so we were obviously a little bit more restrictive than we would have been. But it sort of gives it this kind of slightly isolated, kind of empty cityscape, which in itself I think brought an evocative atmosphere to the film. But absolutely right, a night with John, I think on the Guinnesses is probably something quite different.
Well, so what goes on in John McEnroe's head? I mean,
oh wow! I mean, what doesn't? I think. Well, I can give you an insight into, I guess, the interview process, because I think for John, his brain goes in all different directions almost simultaneously. So you could ask a question like, and you think's fairly straightforward, and it will start with an answer about that, and then segue into something else, and then from there that's a doorway into something else, and before you know it you're kind of 3 streets away from the original question. So I think the challenge with John was kind of getting his energy down and trying to get into a slightly more I guess reflective mood where you would get the answers to the questions you were looking for. But yeah, his head goes it's very analytical, very very sharp, very quite, I would say, skeptical in a way. I think he's can be quite guarded, but at the same time he's very authentic. So he doesn't, there's nothing Machiavellian about McEnroe, for good or bad. He will be very true to how he feels, and that's actually becomes quite a very endearing quality, and obviously for a documentary maker that's also quite a blessing as well.
I mean, as Patti Smythe, I think, mentions early on in the doc, I mean, she relays a story, but basically he's kind of hardwired this way. I guess we're all hardwired to certain ways, but he's certainly this way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's kind of what the film sort of lays out, I guess, some of the evidence to kind of back up that she thinks, he's potentially neurodivergent, or there's something going on there that's never really been diagnosed. And he doesn't care about that at all. It's not. It's other people around him, I guess, that, that obviously Patty, his wife, has been with him over 25 years now, so she sort of knows him better than anyone. But I guess it's her and the kids that I guess have had to navigate that. But for John himself, I mean, he's not too worried. But I do think it does explain a lot of his behavior, definitely.
Well, right, because I think some would probably think, based on, I mean, this goes back many years, his behavior on the court when he was in his late teens and early 20s, that he's a troubled soul, or super brat, as he was called here in the UK. But did you find him that way, really?
No, I think we got him at a good stage of life. I think he has matured and mellowed. So from that perspective, I think it was a good time to speak to him. But there's definitely a trigger in him. I think there's definitely there's certain things that set him off. There's timekeeping, or having time being wasted, not being clearly told what's happening and why. And when you start to kind of experience this while making a film, you start to understand why, say, umpires and things he struggled with, because he saw the court quite mathematically and in dimensions, and if they didn't see it the same way, he struggled to understand that. And secondly, if he's not being listened to, it doesn't have to be agreed with, but if he's not being listened to, that troubles him as well. And I do think certainly from a young age, he's found it difficult to socially connect with other people in a way that other people may find acceptable. So I think that sort of becomes clear, and I think you see that in his relationship with his father as well. Like I think they've always the way they found a kind of a common language, I suppose, was through his success in tennis. And when that wasn't there, I think that they struggled, certainly. What was the substance, beyond that, really?
It's you raise a couple interesting points, because I think in that same thing about what goes on in his mind and how he sees things. It came out, and I hadn't realized this, but he had no control over those. At least 90% of those outbursts is what he says.
Yeah, I think there's an element definitely was an element of he's a performer, he's an entertainer, he likes the battle, he likes the crowd. It's the New York kind of perspective, and in London, obviously, in Wimbledon in particular, and I think even you could compare it to sort of Test cricket of that age as well. It's very considered and you respect and all this kind of stuff. Whereas he came from a New Yorker perspective, where it was like crowds and yelling and throwing stuff and like, come on, and getting everyone up for it. So there was a cultural difference, which he definitely enjoyed. But I think a large element was absolutely, it was just in him. That's just the way his brain worked. It was also the household he was kind of brought up in, and he wasn't able to control it, certainly at a younger age, a lot of the time, I think. But it's interesting because, as you say, like the way he just had this mathematical analysis of the court, and his brain, he was extremely good at maths, and his brain would do the equations and so he'd know if it was in or not. Like he would know, and he couldn't understand other people didn't see it the same way.
Right. Well, this also, well, exactly.
Not
and also,
to excuse some of his behavior, by the way. I think sometimes he was just being an idiot. So
well, indeed, and I think it's a very fair portrayal, because I'm of an age, and I remember certainly the difference between London and New York in the 70s and early 80s was stark compared to what it is now, but at the same time, and so a lot of excuses were made, and he was like, you're kind of, actually, as you point out, he wasn't the original punk tennis player, really. No. There were plenty others before him, Connors and Gerulaitis and others, but he doesn't suffer fools lightly, and that kind of goes back to this point you were saying about the father-son relationship. I mean, this is your film focuses a lot on that. He was such a perfectionist on the court, and maybe you can say a little bit more about that and why that drove so much of the film.
I think it was an angle that had never really been explored. Obviously, there's been lots of TV features about John, and another great documentary, The Realm of Perfection, which is much, much more focused on, I guess, his on-court performances. So I kind of wanted to go further and deeper and get into the kind of much more the human elements of John, because I just felt that there was something unexplored there, and it wasn't something we necessarily set out with regards to his father, but it just sort of seemed to emerge. And I spent a couple of days on the master interview, and it was only by almost like the last hour of the second day where he finally calmed down, and it became very introspective and almost like a kind of therapy session. And that's when more of the father stuff started to emerge, and it just felt like really core, like part of the heart of the film, really, because obviously John now being a father himself and struggling a bit with the relationships with his own children, this theme of connection and, I guess, unresolved grief for his own dad, and not quite understanding why he couldn't have the bond that he wanted, and now he was trying to make sure that he would have the bond with his own children and not to make the same mistakes. That to me felt a very universal theme. It wasn't about tennis at all. It wasn't really about the sport. It was actually just about very human themes, and for me, therefore, as a filmmaker, I was always much more, I guess, drawn to that, and that's why that became central to the film. I think his dad was obviously worked so hard all his life, big, gregarious, sort of larger than life character, and probably struggled to understand John maybe as a younger boy, and as a result, when he was showing success on the court, that was something that they bonded over. And obviously John Sr. got involved as manager and agent and all this kind of stuff, and it just the relationship, I guess, became a business relationship essentially. And then later in life, when John wanted more, I think that created conflict, because he kind of basically sort of said to his dad, step away from the management, let's try and build our own relationship, and that really didn't go down very well. So a lot of unresolved pain there, and for me that felt very, as I say, human and unique to the story, and would take it somewhere away from what people would probably expect, I think. And that was interesting to me.
It's an interesting point. I mean, we had the filmmaker R.J. Cutler on here actually a couple of times, but he mentioned in when we were talking about Belushi, the doc he did, that he and he then mentioned someone else who I can never remember who it is, but some historian or some big name professor of the time, but basically said, if you want to know the man, go to the daddy, basically. And,
right. Okay.
So it's an interesting, I'm not saying that's always the case. Well, I don't know, but it's certainly tried and true. I think it is an interesting perspective to bring to it.
It certainly is. And it was just, as I say, then with John's own children, for me, it was interesting, that kind of battle that he was having to try and not make the same mistakes, and it became for me a little bit, I mean, when I sort of sit back, I sort of think, it's a little bit of when John subsequently watched it, it's a little bit of a parable for him, and a kind of like a little warning for him, almost this kind of time capsule of like, you don't have to necessarily go down the same route as your own dad. You can kind of, and that's, I think, what he's working really hard to do, and to make sure, and Patty's, I think, very important in that. She guides him quite a bit, I think, which helps him a lot.
And I think, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud, because I was a kid when he was a pretty small kid, but, when he's really hit big, but he was, tennis was just everywhere at the time. And, these guys are celebs and gods, and they're on all the tabloids and everything. But I don't know, I'd have to go back, but I don't know if there was any tennis stars before him that had their parents always in the friends box, I mean,
that's a good question, actually.
I mean, he was such, they were, I mean, if you were watching McEnroe, you always knew you were going to see John Sr. and his mother there at the court,
Yeah.
And it's,
it's like they're sitting in judgment almost, isn't it? You're kind of like, they're almost up in the,
or what is this?
Witness box, or.
And there's obviously, this has been dealt with, but, what role, as someone who is a parent myself and not wanting to make the mistakes of the father, but at the same time trying to live up to the father, that kind of thing, you just, what is the right balance? Because obviously they hadn't pushed him. Would he have ever had the tennis career that he had? I mean,
that's the kind of, I think, certainly that's why tennis is a really interesting sport, because it's a very lonely one in that respect. And you are out there on your own, and maybe you wouldn't choose that path, as you say, if you weren't pushed. I think to become a great in that particular sport, you have to start from a young age, and you sacrifice a lot of youth and childhood probably to kind of to get to that level. And then I think, as John found, and even Bjorn Borg found a little bit, you reach the pinnacle, and then it's kind of, I actually feel quite empty now. What's left? And whereas your parents, maybe, particularly if they're like your manager, they're going, okay, great, let's keep going, and you're like, well, actually, I'm not sure I want to be doing this. So that it's an age-old sporting kind of, I guess, warning, isn't it? But I'm not sure there is an answer, really. I read somewhere, I can't claim this, but I read somewhere that sort of amateur sport is for you play, for your own enjoyment, and then when you elite sport is for the crowd, and it's for the fans, and it's less for yourself. And I think that's quite an interesting perspective to have on it. You give up some of your own enjoyment to be that good, almost, which is a strange way to think of it, but yeah.
Well, and I think that's a very good point, because your film raises that as well, because when he gets to the top, he's number one for 4 years, basically. He's at the pinnacle of his game, but he's not happy, right? Seemingly, he says it himself. I mean, and then also, I mean, does he kind of, I mean, I think you're right. People forget what a great tennis player he was, but he must also have regret. Does he have regrets himself? Because he probably could have achieved more if you think in terms of Grand Slams. And I also wonder how much of this is because we've gotten to this era where the greats have 20 or more Grand Slams, when before that, having the number he had made you one of the greatest of all times,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think there's a subliminal feeling of that that he's not in the pantheon of, as you say, these players now have won 20, 25, and it's such a sort of business now, and it's such a kind of different sport. And I think he does feel a little bit, I wouldn't say overlooked, but I think maybe he gets a sense that actually people don't realize quite how good, and not just him, but some of the players were of that time, particularly on courts that were bumpy and they weren't, there wasn't the even bounce, particularly the grass courts that there are now. So I definitely feel there's a sense of that. It's a funny one, but I also feel like he feels, maybe, I lived, he loves the kind of the reflected glory of like being around rock stars and, all that kind of, he loves all that. And maybe if he just sort of stayed in and, strung his racket and that was that, he wouldn't have been, it wouldn't really have suited his personality. So I think all in all, he's come to the point where he lived and enjoyed as much as he could off the court, whilst achieving the pinnacle on the court. He was number one, as you say, for 4 years in a row, and and he did all that, and it didn't actually make him that happy. So I think he going and enjoying the other aspects of life perhaps made him just as happy. But whether that's a little bit of sort of retroactive kind of fitting it to the way things go, I guess that's for everyone else to decide, really. But I definitely feel, and because I was not a big tennis aficionado, I was never like watched it in the summers, when it would be at Wimbledon and but never, really, really deep into the game. So I was surprised going back through the old archive how good he was. I think that's what really actually struck me, and hopefully that comes across a bit more. Just genuinely what a terrific player he was. Exactly. So that was really sort of quite revelatory to me in the process of it.
I think this is a good time to take a quick break. So we'll be right back with Barney Douglas, the director of McEnroe, now on Sky here in the UK.
You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America.
Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with Barney Douglas, the director of McEnroe. Premiered in 2022, has had its theatrical release, and now finally here in the UK on Sky. Nominated for 3 sports Emmys, winning 1. Barney, what's it like working with John McEnroe on a documentary? I mean, I just have this picture of someone turning to you saying, "You're not doing it right," kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely challenging. There's no doubt about it.
He's a perfectionist,
Yeah, I mean, I remember we sent him what I felt was, pretty much the final cut, and he and his wife Patty watched, and they were like, "This is great, this is great." Now we need to make it Wimbledon champion. And I was like, what does that even mean? I was a bit frazzled after 18 months of it. I think with John, I just think clear communication. I think we mentioned earlier, but clear communication, making him feel listened to, but also at the same time, you cannot be a doormat either, because he doesn't respect that. So you need to find a way where you don't pit your ego against him, but you also don't become a walkover. So it was definitely challenging. But I kind of, with John, I think if he really hates something, he will say it. So if he wasn't saying there's no way I'm doing this, and I would just carry on doing it, I mean, that's kind of the way I approached it, really. And just tried to be clear and honest. And if I disagreed with him, I would sort of present the evidence. I kind of, as I say, sort of realized pretty early on he's very analytical and sharp and intelligent guy, and he sniffs out anything that's
BS.
That's sort of exactly. So I was sort of okay. I know that, so I just need to be brave enough to kind of just be pretty straight with him, really.
And you talked about, we've already mentioned it and alluded to it a couple times about how this is not this typical approach to a sports doc, certainly. But how did you decide to make that how do you go about making what approach do you take making a doc about a tennis icon who's also someone who's sort of an anti-establishment hero for many, and like I said, used to she says you can't be serious
Yeah.
about and you can't take a standard talking head approach. Did he laugh at you when you said you need to we need to follow you along the streets of New York?
Well, there was I mean, there was a few challenges we had because, as I mentioned, pandemic-wise, that was restrictive. Obviously, there was also the fact that his career is very front-loaded, so it kind of faded away. So you don't have a natural sporting endpoint either of success or crashing and burning. You know, like there was kind of so there wasn't that arc to it. So I felt like I needed to bring something to the table there. And also just even from a financially practical perspective, the cost of Tennis Archive was insane. So to make 100% archive film, for example, which is obviously quite a popular way of making sports docs recently, just not affordable. Like film wouldn't exist. So you had to find a way to kind of incorporate modern filming as well. So I just latched on very early to the link with the city, the link with like the inside of his mind, and also retracing what I felt was his journey through life from, childhood in this Douglaston sort of suburb of New York to Manhattan. And then Patty, this lady that I feel like in some ways kind of saved his life a bit, really, as the sun rises, so it gave you this natural sort of forced arc in that respect, and then disappear off to memory from there. So I sort of pitched this to John over an extremely strong beer. And I think it appealed to him in terms of it wasn't going to be a traditional sports film. I think he wanted to feel like this was going to be a bit different and a bit special and a bit, just a bit more ambitious. And so I think it sort of ticked those boxes. But I don't think he quite understood until we sort of showed him some footage what I meant, really. I can tell you that because we showed him cuts as we went along, because I didn't want to be at the stage where he was suddenly like, no, this is completely not what I imagined, and I'm quitting. You've got to kind of. So I sort of wanted him to feel involved throughout. So I would show him cuts as we went along, and he sort of got it, I think, pretty quickly. So just let me keep going. So I kept going.
And then as you say, it's not. I mean, your typical sports doc doesn't usually have, animation. Tron-like animation becomes a storytelling device. How did that evolve?
Again, similar things. Like I wanted to pay homage to these kind of 80s American films that I really loved growing up, and get it away from, as we've mentioned, what you might expect in a sports film, and just make it a kind of a filmic journey, really. So there was, Tron was a really good touch point, and for me it felt great to try and do some animation from that perspective, and really get inside his head that way. The sort of City at Night, there's a film called Thief, which I reference quite a lot, which is about this Michael Mann film about this kind of loner guy who's kind of searching for meaning, and that felt very very similar. And the kind of, even down to the palettes of these kind of neon blues that we used throughout the film. I just wanted to make it a visual feast, as well as a kind of an intimate feeling portrait of this guy. So I sort of just poured all those influences into it, really, and just tried to, as I say, make it feel like it sort of was kind of from that era. That was the idea behind it all.
And at the same time, he's had another great career in a way. He's an amazing tennis commentator. I mean, he's iconic in that way for another generation or two.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that was the one thing I sort of thought, is that something that we needed to kind of get in the film? But I actually felt his journey is like his sporting journey, and then as a kind of a man, essentially, kind of done before then. And yes, he's a great commentator, but it didn't feel like something that needed to be part of the film. But what it did present was an interesting challenge, because he's used to speaking in repeat similar kind of phrases and all that kind of stuff. So it was like, okay, that's just great for a broadcast, but actually it wasn't quite the kind of as I say, introspective, slightly slower kind of delivery I was after for the film. So it was just another sort of slight challenge that you had to get through in the interview process to kind of get him out of those habits, really. So, but at the same time, it means when you did need a kind of light-hearted quip or whatever, he was very good at delivering them. So, worked both ways, really.
It reminds me of, I mean, I know people who do political docs, and it's very similar. You've got these; they're used to speaking in sound bites and whatever, and just repeating them over and over again. And then
it is
how do you get
challenging.
to the real person?
You've got to find back doors. You've got to find questions that I think they would not normally obviously be asked, but also that would immediately make them think in a different way. A strange example for me, but one of the things I kind of started a really good conversation with John was, what does love mean to him? And it was something that he almost couldn't. He'd never been asked that in his life, so he was just like it didn't really compute, and because he's very authentic, he really committed to thinking about what it was, and that obviously then set off a sort of a conversation about T, but also his father and what he'd felt from him, and then it opened up all these doorways to the answers and the kind of stuff that I was really looking for. So it was challenging for me, and I had to, in the interview process, I guess I had to get better and learn and evolve and try and work out how to get round the kind of, as you say, the sound bites of this guy, but also try and get into him in a way that he'd never thought before. He doesn't think like that. So that was actually one of the fun parts of it.
And while I think about it, also just wanted to say, and it was some advice I got about another doc I watched recently. To anyone who hasn't seen it and is going to check it out on Sky, definitely use the biggest screen and best sound system you've got because of the look and feel you give it. I'm glad I did. We don't have a large TV in the house, but we have certainly better than a laptop screen, and it made in HD and everything. And so it it's quite an evocative and artful film in the best sense, especially.
It's try to be immersive, basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's a way to put it. Yeah.
We really made it for the big screen, and we were for that kind of sit there and really just sink into it. So I'm glad you were able to find a big TV, because certainly some of the earlier stuff is obviously quite dark. So you're shooting through New York, and we did all that all in pretty much one night and one go, and we just went for it and jumped out the van and just kept going. We didn't have it was literally me, camera guy Lucas, and the producer Paddy, and that was it. That whole film was pretty made probably by three people. So we just went for it. So it's definitely if you can avoid watching on a laptop, it's good. If you've got a big screen at home, that's definitely the way to do it.
Yeah, no, I highly recommend it. And how did you become involved in this project? I mean, I know you have some background with cricket docs and other things.
Well, the last film I did was The Edge, which is about the England cricket team, and there's a mental health aspect to that and everything, and that did pretty well. And the producer on that film, she was working with a company called Dogwoof in the UK that I'm sure you're familiar with, and the McEnroe rights, I think, were sitting there, and I think there'd been previous attempts to make this documentary in the past, and it all kind of crashed and burned because the relationships with John had been difficult and all that kind of thing. So Victoria Burrell, the producer, said, "Do you want to go and meet John? And would you be interested in directing, trying to resurrect this film and do a new film and try and direct?" And I was like, "Yeah, great." I mean, McEnroe, I knew the name. I knew that he was obviously an angry tennis player. That was pretty much the extent of it. So I went to New York and met him, and he answered the door in his dressing gown. He'd been on a big night out, I think, the night before. So that was one of the more surreal experiences of my short documentary career. And I don't know, I was used to dealing with sports, I guess, egos and big players and stuff like that. So I kind of just said the kind of film that I was envisioning, and started the process there, really. And we just Zoomed quite a lot. We had chats, and I got to know him. I just tried to build a bit of a relationship until he was like, "Yeah, okay, let's do this," type thing. So that was it, really. It was just fortuitous. I was in the right place, but I think sometimes these things work out that maybe you look at the right character for the right film, at that particular time. So,
well, exactly, because as you say, others had tried.
That's how it started.
Others had tried. They certainly didn't get anywhere close to as far as you did. I mean, do you think that? Do you think having knowledge but not really it wasn't like you grew up a super fan or anything like that? You think that's helpful?
I do think it's helpful. I wasn't in awe of him from that perspective, and also I wasn't too caught up in tennis. So I wasn't
Right.
caught up in a particular point in a random game in 1983, you know, in Detroit or something. It just wasn't my focus. And I think that really appealed to John, because it's going to sound weird, but like, you know, he's bored of that. Like he's bored of that kind of thing. He knows, of course, that there's elements of his story that to do with the tennis that need to be dug into and presented. But I was very much about the humanity of him and actually presenting him as a shining different lights on his personality rather than the stuff that's been sort of, I guess, repeated ad infinitum over the last 25 years. So that appealed to him definitely. So I think he was pleased that I wasn't just grilling him over various technical aspects of his game.
Right. The 84 French Open versus Lendl and all that kind of... I mean, it's in there, but obviously you had to show that. But yeah, you're not getting fixated on any one point, you know.
No, you're trying to do it from I always trying to make those big sporting moments mean something else. You know, what else is... what different angle can you come at this from? And that, as I say, I think appealed to him definitely. And we talked music, and we talked, you know, influences and bands and all that kind of stuff. So I just think maybe he just felt like I was somebody that he could get along with, and maybe I was giving him a bit more time to understand him and listen to him maybe than he'd experienced previously. But there's still, to begin with, obviously there was that slight, you know, concern. He doesn't necessarily differentiate between a filmmaker and a journalist from Sun, for example. So like, you know, I think to begin with, he had to sort of get past that and realize that we had a different relationship.
Yeah. And so it appealed to him. And I think it's certainly appealing to a larger audience. It's definitely a film worth checking out. We're actually coming to the end of our time. I just was going to ask one last question, if I may. What's next for you?
Good question. I have got a couple in development at the moment. One's a kind of more environmental sort of angled documentary. It's a hybrid doc, so it's going to be quite another sort of leap into the unknown. But I'm really, really excited about that. There's another project with Dogwolf as well that I'm working on, which I can't say anything about yet, which I'm excited about. In fact, there's three that I'm working on, none of which I can say the names of yet.
You guys never can say anything about it.
I know. Well, it's documentary is an interesting landscape because when I first started, I felt like it was quite a democratic kind of place to be. If you could find a story and earn the trust of whoever it was about, then you could, you know, you were in a position to make the film. But it's obviously exploded as a genre, for want of a better word, and you know, big companies, big studios, all that kind of stuff are competing for these stories. So it's a tricky landscape. So sometimes you have to keep them a bit closer. But I promise you, once it's further down the road, I'm very happy to chat to you about them.
Well, would love to have you on again. It was great having you on. Really, really appreciate it, Barney. But we just remind our listeners, we've been here with Barney Douglas, the director of McEnroe. It's now on Sky here in the UK. I'm sure you can stream it elsewhere if you're anywhere else in the world. And yes, nominated for 3 Sports Emmys and won 1. So thanks again, Barney. It's been great chatting with you, and look forward to having you on again. Take care.
Lovely. Thanks very much.
All right. See ya. We hope you enjoyed that episode of Factual America. If you did, please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. I would also like to thank those who make this podcast possible. A big shout out to Sam and Joe at Intersound Audio in York, England. A big thanks to Amy Ord, our podcast manager at Alamo Pictures, who makes sure we continue getting great guests onto the show and everything runs smoothly. And finally, a big thanks to you, our listeners. Many of you have been with us for 4 incredible seasons. Please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas, whether it is on YouTube, social media, or directly by email. This is Factual America, signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.